Thank you for being here and for choosing to listen to my story. It means more than I can express to have someone bear witness to what happened to me, to feel like my experience matters to someone out there beyond the walls of my own life. Your willingness to listen helps me process everything I went through, helps me feel less alone in it. If you're willing to stay with me through this, please consider subscribing. It tells me that my voice has value, that sharing my truth is worth something. This is the hardest story I've ever told, and I'm grateful you're here to hear it. I don't remember the accident itself, which I suppose is a mercy. What I remember is driving home from my mother's house on a Wednesday evening in late March, the sky that particular shade of purple that happens right before full dark. I remember thinking about the pot roast I had left in the slow cooker, wondering if it would be overcooked by the time I got home. I remember the song on the radio, some pop ballad I didn't particularly like but hadn't bothered to change. And then nothing, a blank space where memory should be, a void that stretches from that moment to weeks later, when I finally woke up in a hospital bed with tubes in my arms and a ventilator helping me breathe. What happened in that void, I learned later, piece by piece, from doctors and nurses, and eventually from my lawyer. A drunk driver had run a red light at an intersection 3 blocks from my house. He hit my car on the driver's side at approximately 50 miles an hour. My car spun, hit a telephone pole, and crumpled like paper. Emergency responders had to use the jaws of life to extract me from the wreckage. I was airlifted to the regional trauma center with massive internal bleeding, a punctured lung, a fractured pelvis, and a severe traumatic brain injury. They told my husband, Evan, that I probably wouldn't survive the night. When I did survive, they told him I probably wouldn't wake up. When I showed signs of waking, they told him I probably wouldn't be the same person I had been before. Traumatic brain injuries were unpredictable, they explained. I might have permanent cognitive deficits, personality changes, memory loss. I might need round-the-clock care for the rest of my life. Evan, apparently, decided he didn't want to wait around to find out. I was in a coma for 3 weeks. During that time, while my body fought to heal itself, while machines breathed for me and fed me and monitored every fluctuation of my vital signs, Evan filed for divorce. He did it quietly, through a lawyer who specialized in what they called complex marital dissolution. He claimed irreconcilable differences and cited my uncertain medical condition as grounds for why the marriage could not continue. He requested full ownership of our house, our savings, and release from any financial responsibility for my medical care, arguing that my injuries were the result of an accident for which he bore no responsibility and that he should not be financially devastated by circumstances beyond his control. I learned all of this later, weeks after I woke up, when my mind had cleared enough to understand what was being told to me. At first, I didn't believe it. I thought there had been some mistake, some miscommunication. Evan and I had been married for 8 years. We had bought a house together, adopted a dog together, talked about having children. He was the person I called when something good happened at work. He was the person who brought me soup when I was sick. How could that person have filed for divorce while I was unconscious and fighting for my life? But it was true. All of it. My mother was the one who told me, sitting beside my hospital bed with tears streaming down her face, holding my hand so tightly I thought she might break the bones that were still healing. She had found out by accident, she said. Evan had been avoiding her calls, making excuses for why she couldn't visit me during certain hours. She had finally shown up at the hospital unannounced and overheard him talking to his lawyer in the family waiting area. She had confronted him, and he had admitted everything. He said he couldn't handle it, my mother told me, her voice shaking with rage and grief. He said the doctors told him you might never be the same, and he couldn't tie himself to that kind of life. He said he was sorry, but he had to think about his own future. I lay in that hospital bed, my body still broken and healing, my mind still foggy and struggling to form coherent thoughts, and tried to process what she was saying. It felt unreal, like something from a movie or a nightmare. People didn't actually do this, did they? Walk away from their spouse in their darkest hour, abandon them when they were most vulnerable? But apparently they did. Evan had. The full picture emerged slowly as my brain healed, and I became capable of having longer conversations, of understanding complex information. My neurologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, was the one who explained most of it to me. She was in her 40s, with a calm, measured way of speaking that made even the worst news feel slightly more bearable. She told me that Evan had been pressuring the medical team for prognoses, wanting to know exact timelines for my recovery, exact probabilities for various outcomes. When they couldn't give him certainties, when they told him it was too early to know how complete my recovery would be, he had become increasingly agitated. He asked me directly if you would be able to return to work, to take care of yourself independently, Dr. Chen told me during one of our sessions. She was checking my cognitive function, asking me questions to assess my memory and reasoning. I told him it was too soon to say. Brain injuries are unpredictable. Some patients recover almost completely. Others have lasting deficits. We needed more time to assess. And that's when he decided to file for divorce, I said. It wasn't a question. Dr. Chen's expression was carefully neutral, the professional mask doctors learn to wear when they're dealing with situations that make them angry. That's when he started talking to lawyers, yes. I found out later that Evan had also contacted our insurance company, trying to limit his own liability for my medical expenses. He had argued that since we were legally separated, he shouldn't be responsible for bills incurred after the filing date. The insurance company had denied his request, but the fact that he had tried made me physically sick when I heard about it. He had been calculating costs while I was unconscious, weighing my life against his financial future, and deciding I wasn't worth the expense. The nursing staff, I discovered, hated him. This became apparent once I was well enough to have real conversations, to pick up on the subtle cues in how they spoke about him. They were carefully professional when he was around, but when it was just me and one of the nurses, the mask would slip. "Your mother is a saint," my night nurse, Carlos, told me one evening while helping me practice walking with a walker. "She's been here every day, all day. Your friends too. That woman Jennifer, the one with the red hair, she organized a whole schedule so someone's always here with you." "And my husband?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Carlos's jaw tightened. "I'm not supposed to comment on family dynamics." "But you have an opinion," I pressed. He sighed. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen a lot of different ways people handle it when their loved ones are seriously injured. Your husband's visits became less and less frequent. When he did come, he spent most of the time on his phone or talking to his lawyer in the hallway. He never asked about your progress, never wanted to know about your treatment plan. He just wanted to know when you'd wake up so he could—" He trailed off. "So he could serve me with divorce papers himself instead of having someone else do it," I finished. Carlos didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. I woke up fully, meaning I was taken off the ventilator and became consistently conscious and responsive, on a Tuesday morning in mid-April. It was a gradual process, not the sudden awakening they show in movies. I had been having periods of semi-consciousness for several days, brief windows where I could respond to commands or recognize people before sliding back into confused sleep. But that Tuesday morning, I opened my eyes, and the world came into focus and stayed that way. My mother was there, sitting in the chair beside my bed, her head tilted back and mouth slightly open in the uncomfortable sleep of someone who had spent too many nights in a hospital room. The light coming through the window was the thin, watery light of early spring. I tried to speak and found I couldn't. There was a tube in my throat. I made a sound instead, and my mother's eyes flew open. When she saw me looking at her, really looking at her, her face crumpled, and she started crying. "Oh, thank God," she kept saying, gripping my hand. "Oh, thank God, thank God." The doctors came, and the nurses, and there was a flurry of activity as they assessed me, removed the ventilator, checked my vitals and my responses. My throat was raw, and my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Everything hurt, a deep ache that seemed to radiate from my bones. But I was awake, I was aware, and I was alive. Evan didn't visit that day, or the next, or the day after that. It was my mother who finally told me why, sitting beside my bed and holding my hand, her voice breaking as she explained what he had done while I slept. I didn't cry. I thought I would, thought the news would shatter me, but instead I felt a strange, cold clarity. Everything that had seemed solid in my life had revealed itself to be as fragile as glass. My marriage, my future, my understanding of the person I had chosen to build a life with, all of it was broken. But I was still here, still breathing, still thinking. My body was broken too, but it was healing. Maybe everything else could heal as well, or at least scar over enough that I could function. "I want to see the divorce papers," I told my mother. "Sweetie, you don't need to worry about that right now. You need to focus on getting better." "I want to see them," I repeated, and she must have heard something in my voice that told her not to argue, because she nodded and said she would bring them the next day. She did. I read through them slowly, my brain still foggy and struggling to process legal language. But the basic facts were clear enough. Evan wanted out, wanted the house, wanted to be released from financial responsibility for my care. He was willing to let me keep my retirement account and my car, which was totaled anyway, so that was generous of him. The papers had been filed 2 weeks into my coma, when the doctors were still telling him there was a significant chance I wouldn't survive. I was still reading when Evan walked into my hospital room. It was the first time I had seen him since before the accident, though I didn't remember that last time. He looked the same, neat and put together in slacks and a button-down shirt, his hair carefully styled, his expression arranged into something that probably thought was sympathetic concern, but read more like impatience. "You're awake," he said, stopping in the doorway. "The doctors said you were doing better." I held up the divorce papers. "When were you planning to tell me about this?" His expression shifted, became defensive. "I was going to wait until you were stronger. I didn't want to overwhelm you." "You filed for divorce while I was in a coma, Evan. I'm not sure there's a good time for that conversation." He came further into the room, but he didn't sit down. He stood at the foot of my bed, his hands in his pockets. "I know this looks bad, but you have to understand the doctors said you might never recover. They said you could have permanent brain damage, that you might need constant care. I couldn't put my life on hold indefinitely. We've been married for 8 years. I know that, and I care about you, I do, but I have to think about my own future. This wasn't the life I signed up for." "In sickness and in health," I quoted, "that was the life you signed up for. That's what you promised." His jaw tightened. "Don't throw that at me. You don't know what it's been like sitting here day after day watching you in that bed, not knowing if you'd ever wake up. I couldn't handle it. So you filed for divorce instead." "I needed to protect myself financially. Your medical bills are astronomical. If I stayed married to you, I could lose everything." There it was, finally. The truth underneath all the rationalizations. He was worried about money. Not about me, not about my recovery, but about his bank account and his assets, and the possibility that my medical crisis might cost him something. "Get out," I said. My voice was still weak, barely more than a whisper, but the words were clear. "We need to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Get out of my room and don't come back unless it's with your lawyer." He left. I didn't cry, not then. I just lay in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling and felt something inside me harden into stone. The road to recovery was long and grueling. The physical injuries were bad enough, the fractured pelvis that made walking excruciating, the punctured lung that left me short of breath for months, the internal injuries that required 2 additional surgeries. But it was the brain injury that was the hardest to deal with. I had problems with my short-term memory, would forget conversations I'd had an hour earlier. I had trouble finding words, would reach for a simple term and come up empty, left grasping at air while my mother or my friends waited patiently for me to remember what I was trying to say. I got tired easily, would exhaust myself after an hour of physical therapy and sleep for 3 hours straight. The doctors assured me this was normal, that the brain needed time to heal, just like any other organ. Dr. Chen was optimistic about my prognosis, said I was showing good progress, and there was every reason to believe I would continue to improve. But the uncertainty was maddening. Would I ever be exactly who I was before the accident? Would these cognitive deficits fade completely? Or would I always struggle to find words, always forget appointments, always need more sleep than a normal person? I was in the hospital for 6 weeks total, before they transferred me to a rehabilitation facility. It was a depressing place, all institutional beige walls, and the smell of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. My roommate was a woman in her 70s who had had a stroke and spent most of her time staring blankly at the television. I did physical therapy every day, occupational therapy 3 times a week, and cognitive therapy twice a week. Slowly, incrementally, I got stronger. My mother visited every day. My best friend Jennifer visited several times a week, bringing gossip from work and magazines, and once, memorably, a flask of bourbon that we passed back and forth in violation of every facility rule. My other friends cycled through on a schedule Jennifer had organized. Even my co-workers sent cards and flowers, though I knew from Jennifer that they had been told I probably wouldn't be returning to work anytime soon. Evan visited twice during my time at the rehab facility. Both times, it was with his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, who looked at me like I was a problem to be solved. They wanted me to sign the divorce papers, to agree to Evan's terms. I refused. Patricia explained in a tone of exaggerated patience that fighting it would be expensive and stressful and ultimately futile. "The marriage is over," she said. "You know that. He knows that. Why drag this out and make it ugly?" "Because he filed for divorce while I was unconscious and fighting for my life," I said. "And because his terms are insulting." "What do you want?" Evan asked, his voice tight with frustration. "The house," I said, "and half of everything else. The savings, the investments, all of it." "That's ridiculous. You can't even work right now. How are you going to maintain a house?" "That's my problem, not yours. You want it out? Fine. But you don't get to abandon me and take everything with you." We didn't reach an agreement. They left, and I went back to physical therapy, where I took out my anger and frustration on the parallel bars and the exercise equipment until my therapist told me to ease up before I re-injured myself. I hired a lawyer of my own, a woman named Gloria Santos, who had been recommended by Jennifer. Gloria was in her 50s, with short silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of my high school principal. She listened to my story, reviewed the divorce filing, and let out a low whistle. "He really filed while you were in a coma," she said. It wasn't a question, more like she was confirming the audacity of it. "Is that illegal?" I asked. "No. Unfortunately. Unethical as hell, but not illegal. However, we can absolutely use it against him. Any judge with a soul is going to be appalled by this. We can fight for a much better settlement than what he's offering." "I want the house," I said, "and I want him to cover at least half of my medical bills that insurance didn't pay." Gloria smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. "Let's see what we can do." The divorce proceedings dragged on for months. I was discharged from the rehab facility and moved back in with my mother, since I couldn't manage stairs yet, and my mother's house was a single story. I continued with outpatient therapy, slowly regaining my strength and mobility. My cognitive function improved, the fog gradually lifting. I still had memory lapses and trouble with word retrieval, but they were becoming less frequent. Gloria fought for me with a tenacity that both impressed and terrified me. She subpoenaed Evan's financial records and discovered he had been moving money out of our joint accounts and into his own personal accounts for months before the accident, almost like he had been planning for this. She deposed the hospital staff, getting them to testify about Evan's behavior during my coma, his lack of interest in my condition, his focus on financial matters. She built a case that painted Evan not just as a man who had made a difficult decision under pressure, but as a calculated opportunist who had seen his wife's medical crisis as a chance to escape the marriage with his finances intact. Evan's lawyer tried to argue that his actions were reasonable, that anyone would be concerned about potential financial devastation from a spouse's catastrophic medical emergency. Gloria countered that his concern had manifested before he even knew the extent of my injuries or my prognosis, that he had filed for divorce when doctors were still telling him I might not survive. She argued that this showed a fundamental lack of good faith, that he had broken the marital contract in the most egregious way possible. The judge, a woman in her 60s, who had been on the bench for over 20 years, was clearly not impressed with Evan. I was there for the final hearing, sitting in the courtroom in a wheelchair because I still couldn't walk long distances without assistance. I watched the judge's face as Gloria presented her case, saw the tightening around her mouth, the cold look in her eyes when she glanced at Evan. When it was time for the ruling, the judge didn't mince words. I have presided over many divorce cases in my career, and I have seen people behave badly in a variety of ways. But I have rarely seen such a clear case of abandonment and financial opportunism as this one. Mr. Reeves, you filed for divorce while your wife was unconscious and critically injured, before the full extent of her injuries or her capacity for recovery could be determined. You attempted to shed financial responsibility for her care while she was at her most vulnerable. Your actions demonstrate a profound lack of character and a complete absence of the partnership that is supposed to define a marriage. She awarded me the house, half of all marital assets, and ordered Evan to pay 60% of my outstanding medical bills. It was more than I had hoped for, a vindication that felt both satisfying and hollow. I had won, but what I had won was the end of my marriage, the dissolution of the life I had thought I was building. Evan's face was red with anger as the judge read her decision. His lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear, probably telling him not to say anything. After the hearing, he cornered me in the hallway outside the courtroom. "I hope you're happy," he said. "You just ruined me financially." "You filed for divorce while I was in a coma," I said. My voice was steady now, stronger than it had been in months. "You tried to abandon me when I needed you most. You did this to yourself. The doctors said you might never recover. What was I supposed to do? Waste my life taking care of a vegetable?" The word hit me like a physical blow. Is that how he had seen me? Lying in that hospital bed fighting for my life? As a vegetable? as something less than human, not worth his time or his money or his vows. "You were supposed to be my husband," I said quietly. "You were supposed to love me." "Yeah, well, love doesn't pay medical bills." He walked away, and I watched him go, and I felt nothing but relief that he was no longer part of my life. Recovery continued, slower than I wanted, but steady. I moved back into the house, our house, my house now, 8 months after the accident. It felt strange to be there without Evan, to see the spaces where his things had been, the empty closet, the gaps on the bookshelves. But it also felt like mine, in a way it never had before. I rearranged the furniture, painted the bedroom a color I liked, and Evan had always vetoed, adopted a cat from the local shelter. I was rebuilding, piece by piece. Physically, I was getting stronger. I could walk without assistance, though I tired easily and had to use a cane for long distances. The cognitive issues were improving, but still present. I still forgot things, still struggled to find words occasionally. Dr. Chen said I might always have some residual effects from the brain injury, that there were some pathways that might never fully reconnect. But I was functional, independent, capable of taking care of myself. The question was, what to do with my life now? I couldn't go back to my old job. It had been too long, and the company had moved on without me. I had received a settlement from the drunk driver's insurance company, enough to cover my medical bills and provide some cushion while I figured things out. But I needed purpose, needed something to do with my days beyond therapy appointments and doctor's visits. It was Dr. Chen who suggested I consider speaking to other traumatic brain injury patients. "You have a unique perspective," she said during one of our follow-up appointments. "You've been through it, you understand the challenges in a way that doctors and therapists can't. And you're articulate about your experience. That could be valuable to people who are just starting their recovery." I started volunteering at the hospital, meeting with patients who were in the early stages of recovery from brain injuries. I would sit with them or with their families and talk about my experience. I told them about the fog and the frustration, about the slow, incremental progress that felt like no progress at all until you looked back and realized how far you'd come. I told them about the fear that I would never be myself again, and how I had gradually come to understand that I wasn't the same person I had been before. But that didn't mean I was less. I was just different. The families always wanted to know about my husband. It came up inevitably, because they were dealing with their own fears about what would happen to their relationships, whether their spouse or child or parent would still be the person they loved after the injury. I told them the truth. I told them about Evan filing for divorce while I was unconscious, about the fight over assets, about the judge's ruling, and I told them that while it had been devastating at the time, I had come to see it as a blessing in disguise. Evan's betrayal had shown me who he really was, had freed me from a marriage that was built on conditional love. The people who had stayed, my mother, my friends, they were the ones who mattered. 1 year after the accident, I organized a fundraiser for the hospital's neuroscience department. It was partially to raise money for research and patient services, but it was also a way to mark the anniversary, to turn it into something positive. Jennifer helped me plan it, along with a committee of volunteers I had met through my work at the hospital. We held it at a local hotel, a dinner and auction with speakers who talked about their experiences with traumatic brain injury. I gave a speech that night, standing at a podium in front of 200 people, many of whom had their own stories of survival and recovery. I talked about the accident, about waking up to discover my husband had abandoned me, about the long road of recovery, and I talked about what I had learned, that resilience wasn't about being strong all the time. It was about continuing to move forward, even when you felt like you couldn't. It was about accepting help when you needed it, and offering help when you could. It was about building a life worth living, even when that life looked nothing like what you had planned. The event raised over $50,000 for the hospital. More importantly, it connected me with a whole network of survivors and advocates, people who were working to improve outcomes for brain injury patients and their families. I started getting invited to speak at other events, to participate in panel discussions, to consult on patient advocacy programs. 18 months after the accident, I started a nonprofit organization focused on supporting families dealing with traumatic brain injuries. The organization provided resources and information, connected families with services, and advocated for better medical care and insurance coverage. It was modest at first, just me and a part-time assistant working out of a small office I rented in a shared workspace downtown. But it grew. I hired staff, people who had their own experiences with brain injury, either as patients or as caregivers. We developed programs, created support groups, lobbied the state legislature for better protections for patients and their families. It became my purpose, the thing that made sense of everything I had been through. I couldn't undo the accident or erase the trauma, but I could use my experience to help others navigate the same impossible journey. 3 years after the accident, I ran into Evan at a restaurant. I was there with Jennifer and some other friends, celebrating the anniversary of the nonprofit. He was there with a woman I didn't recognize, younger than me, pretty in a generic way. We made eye contact across the restaurant, and I saw him tense, saw him consider whether to approach me or pretend he hadn't seen me. He approached. The woman stayed at their table, watching with obvious curiosity. "You look good," Evan said. It sounded like an accusation. "I'm doing well," I said. "The doctors were more optimistic than you gave them credit for." "I heard you started some kind of charity, brain injury thing?" "A non-profit, yes. We've helped over 300 families so far." He nodded, his jaw tight. "Good for you. How are you?" I asked, not because I cared, but because it seemed like the polite thing to say. "Fine. Great. I'm engaged, actually." He gestured toward the woman at his table. "Getting married in the fall." "Congratulations," I said, and meant it. I hoped he would be happy, hoped this new woman would never discover the limits of his loyalty and compassion. "I guess things worked out for both of us then," he said. "I suppose they did." He hesitated, and for a moment I thought he might apologize, might acknowledge what he had done, the cruelty of abandoning me when I was helpless. But the moment passed, and he just nodded and walked back to his table. "You okay?" Jennifer asked when he was gone. "Yeah," I said, and realized it was true. Seeing him didn't hurt anymore. He was just a person I used to know, someone from a chapter of my life that was closed. The years continued to unfold. The nonprofit grew, expanding to serve families across the state and eventually the region. I hired a proper staff, moved into a real office, developed partnerships with hospitals and rehabilitation facilities. I became something of a public figure in the brain injury community, known for my advocacy work and my willingness to speak openly about my experience. I dated occasionally, though it was complicated. The brain injury had left me with some quirks that were hard to explain to someone who hadn't been through it. I needed more sleep than most people, needed quiet environments because I got overwhelmed easily in loud or chaotic spaces. I still occasionally forgot things, or struggled to find words. Most men were understanding at first, but the relationship would inevitably reach a point where my limitations became annoying rather than endearing, and they would drift away. I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need a relationship to be happy. And mostly, that was true. My work was fulfilling, my friendships were deep and meaningful, my life had purpose. But there were lonely nights when I wondered what it would be like to have a partner again, someone to share the small moments with. It was 4 years after the accident when I met Marcus. He was a neurologist, newly hired at the hospital where I volunteered. We were introduced at a staff meeting, and he mentioned that he had heard me speak at a conference the previous year. We started having coffee together occasionally, talking about the hospital's programs and the challenges of patient care. He was easy to talk to, thoughtful and earnest, with a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard. It took me months to realize he was interested in me romantically. I had gotten so used to thinking of myself as damaged goods, as someone whose medical history made me undateable, that I missed all the signs. It was Jennifer who finally told me, exasperated, that he was clearly into me and I needed to pay attention. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant near the hospital. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been in years, worried that I would forget something important or stumble over my words or reveal some deficit that would make him reconsider. But Marcus knew my history, knew about the brain injury and the recovery. He had read my medical charts, had consulted with Dr. Chen about my case. He knew exactly what he was getting into, and he was interested anyway. "I'm not the easiest person to date," I told him over dinner. "I have limitations, things that are just going to be part of who I am now." "Everyone has limitations," Marcus said. "And from what I've seen, you're one of the most capable people I know. I forget things. I get tired easily. Loud places overwhelm me. So we'll work with that. We'll keep a shared calendar. We'll plan quiet dates. We'll make sure you get enough rest. None of that seems insurmountable." It was such a simple statement, but it moved me almost to tears. He wasn't trying to fix me or change me or pretend my limitations didn't exist. He was just willing to accommodate them, to work around them, to see them as part of the whole person I was, rather than as flaws that made me less than. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. It was nothing dramatic, just the two of us at my house one evening, cooking dinner together. He turned to me while stirring pasta sauce and said, "I think we should get married." I stared at him. "That's your proposal?" "I can do something more elaborate if you want, but the answer's going to be the same. I love you. I want to spend my life with you. I want to make it official. What do you think?" "I think yes," I said, and he grinned and kissed me, and the pasta sauce almost burned while we stood there in my kitchen, holding each other. We got married in a small ceremony in my mother's backyard, 6 years after the accident that had nearly killed me and definitely ended my first marriage. It was nothing, like my first wedding, which had been a lavish affair at a country club with 200 guests and an open bar. This one was intimate, just family and close friends, with Jennifer officiating and my mother crying happy tears throughout the entire ceremony. During the vows, Marcus promised to love me in sickness and health, and I heard the weight behind those words. He knew what they meant in a way Evan never had. He had seen me at my worst, knew about the cognitive deficits and the limitations and the bad days when everything felt too hard. And he was choosing me anyway, choosing to build a life with me, not despite my history, but with full knowledge and acceptance of it. My work with the nonprofit continued, grew. We expanded our services, developed new programs, partnered with research institutions to improve outcomes for brain injury patients. I testified before the state legislature, wrote op-eds for major newspapers, became a voice for people who often struggled to advocate for themselves. And through it all, I carried the memory of waking up in that hospital bed and discovering that my husband had tried to abandon me. It had been the worst moment of my life, worse even than the accident itself. But it had also been a clarifying moment. It had shown me who I could rely on and who I couldn't. It had forced me to rebuild my life from the ground up, to figure out who I was beyond my marriage and my career and all the external markers of identity. It had made me stronger in ways I never wanted to be strong, but was grateful for nonetheless. 7 years after the accident, I was invited to speak at a national conference on traumatic brain injury. It was a huge event, thousands of attendees, held in a convention center in Chicago. I was one of the keynote speakers, which was both exciting and terrifying. I had spoken at many events by this point, but this was different. This was the big stage, the validation that my work and my advocacy mattered on a national level. I stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, at doctors and nurses and therapists and patients and families, all of whom were connected by the common thread of brain injury. I told my story, the whole story, from the accident to the divorce to the recovery to the nonprofit. I talked about Evan's betrayal, not to shame him, but to illustrate a larger point about how society often fails to support families dealing with catastrophic medical events. I talked about the financial pressures that can tear marriages apart, about the way our healthcare system can devastate families already dealing with impossible circumstances. And I talked about resilience, about the human capacity to survive and adapt and find meaning even in the worst situations. I talked about the community I had found, the people who had supported me, and the people I had been able to support in turn. I talked about building a life that was different from what I had planned, but no less valuable, no less worth living. The applause when I finished was thunderous. People stood, and I saw tears on many faces. Afterward, dozens of people approached me, wanting to share their own stories, to tell me how much my words had meant to them. I stood there for hours, listening and hugging strangers and feeling the weight of connection that comes from shared experience. That night, back in my hotel room, I called Marcus. "I wish you could have been here," I told him. "It was incredible." "I'm so proud of you," he said. "I knew you'd be amazing." I keep thinking about how different my life is now compared to 7 years ago. If someone had told me then that this is where I'd end up, I wouldn't have believed them. "Would you go back?" Marcus asked. "If you could undo the accident, undo everything that happened, would you?" I thought about it carefully. "I don't know," I admitted. The accident was horrible. What Evan did was horrible. The recovery was one of the hardest things I've ever been through. But this life I have now, this work, this community, you, I wouldn't have any of it if things had gone differently. So I don't know. I think maybe I wouldn't go back, even if I could. Is that strange? "I think it's human," Marcus said. "We're shaped by what we survive. And you've survived a lot." I hung up and sat by the window of my hotel room, looking out at the lights of Chicago spread below me. Somewhere in this city were people dealing with their own catastrophes, their own moments of betrayal and loss. Somewhere were families sitting in hospital waiting rooms, trying to understand what had happened to their loved ones, trying to figure out how to move forward. Somewhere was a person who had just woken up from a coma to discover their life had been dismantled in their absence. I couldn't reach all of them. I couldn't fix the system that failed them or undo the cruelty they might face. But I could tell my story, could build organizations that helped, could advocate for change. I could turn my survival into something that mattered, could use my experience to light the way for others walking similar paths. 10 years after the accident, almost to the day, I stood in the neuroscience wing of the hospital where I had spent so much time as a patient. They were dedicating a new patient resource center, a space where families could go to get information and support and respite from the exhausting work of caring for a loved one with a brain injury. My nonprofit had helped fund it, and the hospital had asked me to speak at the dedication. Dr. Chen was there, retired now, but still actively involved in patient advocacy. Carlos, my old night nurse, was there, still working the same shift he had worked a decade ago. My mother was there, older now, but still fierce in her love and support. Marcus was there, standing at the back of the room, giving me an encouraging smile. I told the assembled crowd about waking up in a hospital bed down the hall, about the fear and confusion, and the devastating news my mother had had to deliver. I told them about the doctors and nurses who had saved my life and supported my recovery. And I told them about Dr. Chen, who had given me hope when I needed it most. There was a moment, I said, looking at Dr. Chen, when my husband was pressuring you for a prognosis, for certainties about my recovery. And you told him it was too early to know that brain injuries are unpredictable. You refused to write me off, refused to give up on my potential to recover. That decision, that refusal to give up, made all the difference. Dr. Chen's eyes were bright with tears. After the ceremony, she pulled me aside. "I'm so proud of what you've built," she said. "You've helped so many people." "I had good teachers," I said. "You showed me what real care looks like, what it means to advocate for someone who can't advocate for themselves." "For what it's worth," Dr. Chen said, "when your husband asked me about your prognosis, I knew he was asking the wrong questions. He wasn't asking if you would recover. He was asking if you would be a burden. And I knew right then that regardless of how you recovered, you deserved better than him." "Did you say anything to him?" "I told him that in my experience, the most important factor in recovery was having strong support from loved ones. I may have implied that his attitude was not conducive to your healing." She smiled slightly. "He didn't appreciate that." I laughed. "Thank you for everything." The resource center opened, and it was everything I had hoped for. A comfortable space with natural light, resources and information, staff trained to support families through the most difficult times. It was a concrete manifestation of the work I had been doing for years, proof that change was possible, that systems could improve, that individual experiences of suffering could be transformed into collective benefit. Life continued. Marcus and I bought a house together, a small craftsman with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. I continued to run the nonprofit, to speak at conferences, to advocate for policy changes. I wrote a book about my experience, which was published to modest success and led to more speaking opportunities. I was busy and fulfilled and happy in a way that felt earned rather than assumed. I thought about Evan sometimes, though less and less as the years passed. I wondered if he ever regretted what he had done, if he ever looked back on his decision to file for divorce while I was unconscious and felt shame. I wondered if his new marriage was happy, if he had learned anything from our relationship and its dissolution. But mostly, I didn't think about him at all. He was a character from a story I used to tell myself about who I was, and that story had been rewritten so many times that he had become almost unrecognizable. 15 years after the accident, my nonprofit merged with a larger national organization, expanding our reach and resources exponentially. I became the director of patient advocacy for the combined organization, a position that gave me a platform to affect policy at a national level. We successfully lobbied for legislation protecting the rights of patients and their families, for better insurance coverage of rehabilitation services, for increased funding for traumatic brain injury research. I stood in the Capitol building in Washington, watching the bill I had helped craft being signed into law, and I thought about that night I had woken up in the hospital to discover my husband had tried to abandon me. It felt like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different person. In a sense, it had. The person I was now had been forged in the crucible of that betrayal and the recovery that followed. I was harder in some ways, more cynical about people's capacity for cruelty, but I was also more compassionate, more aware of the strength it takes just to survive, more committed to ensuring that others didn't have to face what I had faced alone. That evening, I called my mother from my hotel room in D.C. She was in her 80s now, moving slower but still sharp and engaged. "We did it," I told her. "The bill passed." "I'm so proud of you," she said, and her voice shook with emotion. I think about that awful time when you were in the hospital, when we didn't know if you would make it. I never could have imagined you'd be where you are now. I couldn't have done it without you, I said. You were there every day. You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. That's what mothers do, she said simply. When I hung up, I stood at the window and looked out at the monuments and government buildings, at the physical manifestation of power and policy. I had a voice in that now, a seat at the table where decisions were made. It felt surreal and significant and deeply satisfying. Marcus flew in the next day to celebrate with me. We had dinner at a restaurant near the Capitol, and he raised his glass in a toast. To you, he said. To everything you've accomplished. To us, I corrected. I couldn't do this without you. You could, he said. You're the strongest person I know, but I'm glad you don't have to. We clinked glasses, and I looked at this man I had married, this person who had chosen to love me with full knowledge of my scars and limitations. I thought about Evan, who had tried to escape me at the first sign of difficulty. The contrast was stark, almost painfully so. Do you ever think about him? Marcus asked, reading my mind in the way he sometimes could. Not really, I said. Sometimes I wonder what he's doing if he's happy, but it's abstract curiosity, not real interest. He's not part of my life anymore. Do you think you've forgiven him? I considered the question carefully. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. I'm not angry anymore, if that's what you mean. What he did was cruel and selfish, but I don't spend energy hating him for it. I've moved on. Maybe that's forgiveness, or maybe it's just indifference. You're a better person than I am, Marcus said. If someone had done that to me, I'd probably still be angry. The anger was exhausting, I said, and it didn't change anything. He did what he did. I can't undo it. All I can do is move forward and try to make something meaningful out of the wreckage. 20 years after the accident, I retired from my position at the nonprofit. It felt like the right time. I was in my mid-50s, tired in a bone-deep way that came from decades of fighting battles, both personal and systemic. The organization was in good hands, led by a younger generation of advocates who brought fresh energy and ideas. I had done my part. It was time to step back. Marcus and I traveled, something we had never had time for when we were both working full-time. We went to Europe, to Asia, to South America. We hiked and explored and ate amazing food and slept in when we wanted to. It was a kind of freedom I had never experienced, untethered from deadlines and responsibilities. But I found I couldn't fully step away from the work. I continued to speak occasionally at conferences, to mentor young advocates, to write about issues related to brain injury and patient rights. It was in my blood now, this work. It had become part of who I was. One afternoon, while we were visiting a small town in Italy, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Is this Elena Reeves? A woman's voice asked. She sounded young, uncertain. It's Elena Mendez now. But yes, who is this? My name is Sophie. You don't know me, but I'm married to Evan Reeves, your ex-husband. The world seemed to tilt slightly. I sat down on a bench outside the cafe where Marcus and I had been having lunch. Okay, I said carefully. What can I do for you? Evan had a stroke 3 weeks ago, Sophie said, and her voice broke. It was massive. He's in a coma. The doctors don't know if he'll wake up, and if he does, they don't know what kind of condition he'll be in. I waited, not sure what she wanted from me. He filed for divorce, she continued. Last week, while he's in a coma, his lawyer called me to tell me he had filed paperwork before the stroke, giving them authority to proceed in case he was incapacitated. He's trying to divorce me so I can't get his assets if he recovers or his life insurance if he doesn't. The irony was so overwhelming I almost laughed. Instead, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," I said. "That's horrible." "I found out about what he did to you," Sophie said. "After I got the divorce papers, I started researching, trying to understand how this was legal. And I found articles about your case, about him filing for divorce while you were in a coma. I know it's strange to call you, but I didn't know who else to talk to. Everyone else thinks I should just accept it, that it's reasonable for him to protect his assets. But it's not reasonable, is it? It's cruel." "Yes," I said. "It's cruel." "How did you survive it?" she asked. "How did you get through it?" I looked across the piazza, where Marcus was sitting at a table, giving me privacy but close enough to be there if I needed him. I thought about my mother and Jennifer and Dr. Chen and Carlos and Gloria and every other person who had stood by me when Evan walked away. I thought about the nonprofit and the patients I had helped and the legislation I had influenced and the life I had built from ruins. I had help, I said. A lot of help. My mother, my friends, my medical team, my lawyer. I couldn't have done it alone, and I had to accept that the person I thought I married didn't actually exist. The real Evan was the one who filed for divorce while I was unconscious. Once I accepted that, I could start moving forward. "I'm so angry," Sophie said, and she was crying now. "I'm so angry at him, at the doctors who won't tell me anything, at his lawyer, at this whole situation. I feel like I'm drowning." "The anger is normal," I said. "Let yourself feel it, but don't let it consume you. Focus on what you need to survive right now. Get a good lawyer, document everything, build your support system, and remember that this is not a reflection on you. His actions tell you who he is, not who you are." We talked for another 20 minutes. I gave her Gloria's contact information, the names of support organizations, advice about navigating the medical and legal systems. When we finally hung up, I sat on that bench in the Italian sun and felt the weight of history repeating itself. Marcus came over and sat beside me. "That sounded intense. You okay?" "That was Evan's current wife," I said. "He had a stroke, he's in a coma, and he filed for divorce so he could protect his assets." Marcus stared at me. "You're kidding." "I wish I was. He did exactly what he did to me, to her." "That's..." He trailed off, unable to find words. "It's who he is," I said. "I thought maybe he had changed, maybe he learned something. But people don't change, not fundamentally. His nature is to protect himself first, at any cost. He did it to me, and he did it to her, and he probably would have done it to anyone." "How do you feel about it?" "Sad," I said after a moment. "Not for him, for her, and sad that he never became better than he was, but also relieved in a strange way. It confirms that leaving me wasn't some unique failure of our relationship. It was just who he is." We sat there in the Italian sun, and I thought about the girl I had been 20 years ago, waking up in a hospital bed to discover her life had been demolished. I thought about the long road from that moment to this one, the pain and growth and transformation that had brought me here. And I thought about Sophie, just starting that same terrible journey, and I hoped she would find her way through it. That evening, I sent Sophie a long email with resources and suggestions and encouragement. I told her my full story, the parts I hadn't had time to share on the phone. And I told her that survival was possible, that there was life on the other side of betrayal, that she could build something new and meaningful from the ruins of what she had thought her life would be. She wrote back 2 days later. Evan had died without regaining consciousness. His attempt to divorce her had failed. The paperwork hadn't been finalized before his death, so she was still legally his wife and beneficiary. She was grieving and angry and relieved all at once. She thanked me for talking to her, for giving her perspective when she felt most alone. I wrote back and offered to talk anytime she needed to. We exchanged a few more emails over the following months, then gradually lost touch. But I thought about her sometimes, hoped she was finding her way to healing. Marcus and I returned home from our travels, back to our little house with its garden. I resumed my volunteer work with local brain injury support groups, continued to write and speak occasionally. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm, purposeful, but not overwhelming. I was 60 when my mother passed away. She had lived a long, full life, and her death was peaceful, but it left a hole in my world that couldn't be filled. She had been my anchor, my greatest supporter, the person who had never wavered in her belief in me. The grief was profound. At her funeral, I spoke about her strength and her love, about how she had sat beside my hospital bed every day for weeks, refusing to give up on me even when the doctors said there might be nothing left to hope for. I talked about how she had been the one to tell me about Evan's betrayal, how much it had cost her to deliver that news, how fiercely she had advocated for me in the divorce proceedings. My mother taught me that love is not just a feeling, it's a commitment, I said. It's showing up even when it's hard. It's being present, even when you don't know what to say or how to help. It's refusing to abandon someone when they need you most. That's the lesson she gave me. And it's the lesson I've tried to carry forward in my work and my life. After the funeral, Jennifer pulled me aside. We were both older now, graying and softer around the edges, but our friendship had only deepened with time. "Your mom would be so proud of everything you've accomplished," she said. "I hope so," I said. "I owe her so much." "You gave her a lot too," Jennifer said. "Purpose, pride, the knowledge that her daughter had survived and thrived despite everything. That matters." I knew she was right. My mother had lived to see me build a meaningful life from the wreckage of the accident. She had seen me remarry, seen the nonprofit flourish, seen me make a difference in the world. That was its own kind of gift. Years continued to pass, each one adding layers to the story of who I had become. I was a survivor, an advocate, a wife, a friend. I was someone who had been abandoned in my darkest hour and had found a way not just to survive, but to transform that abandonment into fuel for change. I was imperfect and scarred and still struggling with some cognitive deficits that would never fully resolve. But I was also strong and compassionate and committed to making the world better for people who came after me. On the anniversary of the accident, which I still marked every year, I would sit quietly and reflect on everything that had happened. 25 years later, the memories had lost some of their sharp edges, but they were still there, still a part of who I was. The accident, the coma, waking up to betrayal, the long, grueling recovery, the divorce, the decision to turn my suffering into advocacy, meeting Marcus, building the nonprofit, the legislation, the speaking engagements, Sophie's phone call, my mother's death, all of it had shaped me, had made me into the person I was. I wouldn't wish my experience on anyone, wouldn't minimize the trauma and pain of it. But I also wouldn't trade the wisdom and perspective that had come from surviving it. I had learned things about resilience and human nature and the complexity of healing that I never could have learned any other way. I was 70 when I wrote my second book, a reflection on resilience and recovery told through the stories of the many people I had worked with over the decades. It was published to critical acclaim, won several awards, and became required reading in some medical and social work programs. I was invited to give lectures at universities, to consult with hospitals about their patient support programs, to appear on podcasts and television programs. It was strange being recognized for the worst thing that had ever happened to me. But I had learned to live with that strangeness, to accept that my pain had become public in service of helping others. It was the bargain I had made, and I didn't regret it. Marcus and I celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary quietly, just the two of us at a cabin by a lake. We sat on the dock in the evening, watching the sun set over the water, and he took my hand. "I love our life," he said simply. "Me too," I said. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't had the accident?" he asked. "If Evan hadn't filed for divorce, if you'd stayed married to him?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "I think I would have been unhappy, probably. I don't think I realized it at the time, but there were signs that our marriage wasn't what I thought it was. The accident just revealed it faster and more brutally than it might have otherwise. So, in a way, he did you a favor." "I wouldn't go that far," I said, "but he freed me to build a better life, even if that wasn't his intention. So I guess I should be grateful for that, in a twisted way." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. I thought about all the ways my life had diverged from the path I thought it would take, about the accident that had nearly killed me and the betrayal that could have destroyed me. I thought about the choice I had made, consciously or unconsciously, to survive and then to thrive, to take the broken pieces of my life and arrange them into something beautiful and meaningful. It hadn't been easy. There had been years of pain and struggle, moments when I wanted to give up, times when the weight of other people's trauma felt too heavy to carry. But I had kept going, kept showing up, kept trying to make a difference. And in the end, that persistence had created a life I was proud of, a legacy that would outlast me. The last time I thought about Evan was when I was 75, sorting through old papers and documents in preparation for downsizing to a smaller house. I found a folder I had forgotten about, containing copies of the original divorce papers he had filed while I was in a coma. I sat on the floor of my office and read through them, seeing them with the perspective of decades. They were clinical, bloodless documents, reducing the end of our marriage to legal jargon and financial calculations. There was nothing in them about love or betrayal or the breaking of vows, just a dispassionate accounting of assets and liabilities, a request for dissolution. I sat there with those papers in my hands and realized I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no sense of injury. They were just documents, yellowed with age, detailing events that had happened to a person I barely recognized as myself anymore. The girl who had been married to Evan, who had trusted him completely, who had believed in their future together. That person was gone. She had died in some sense when I woke up in that hospital bed, and someone else had been born in her place. I threw the papers away. I didn't need them anymore, didn't need to carry that evidence of betrayal around with me. I had told the story enough times that it was imprinted in me, part of my permanent record. The physical documents were superfluous. Marcus found me sitting on the office floor, surrounded by boxes and memories. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm good," I said. "Just going through old stuff." He helped me up, and we continued the work of sorting through decades of accumulated life. It was a kind of meditation, deciding what to keep and what to let go, what mattered enough to carry forward and what could be released. In the end, I kept very little. Some photos, some documents related to the nonprofit, some personal mementos that held meaning. The rest I donated or threw away or passed on to people who might find use in it. It was liberating, shedding the weight of the past. We moved into a smaller house, a cozy bungalow with an easy maintenance yard and everything on one level. My mobility had decreased with age, and the stairs in our old house had become a challenge. The new place was perfect, compact and comfortable and filled with light. I was 80 when Marcus died. It was sudden, a heart attack while he was out on his morning walk. I got the call from a neighbor who had found him collapsed on the sidewalk, had tried to resuscitate him while waiting for the ambulance. But it was too late. He was gone before he reached the hospital. The grief was overwhelming, all-consuming. After 25 years of marriage, after building a life together, after learning to trust and love again, he was simply gone. I felt untethered, lost in a way I hadn't felt since the early days after the accident. But I had learned something about survival in the decades since that terrible time. I had learned that grief was something you moved through, not something you got over. I had learned that loss changed you, but didn't have to destroy you. I had learned that there could be meaning and purpose even in the darkest times. I leaned on the people who loved me. Jennifer, now in her 80s, but still sharp and present. The staff and volunteers from the nonprofit, many of whom had become family. The community of survivors and advocates I had spent decades building relationships with. They showed up for me the way I had shown up for so many others over the years. They sat with me, listened to me, helped me navigate the practical and emotional challenges of loss. I continued to live because that's what you do. You continue to live even when the person you loved most is gone. You find small reasons to get out of bed, small moments of joy or purpose or connection. You honor their memory by living as fully as you can with the time you have left. I was 85 when I gave my last public speech. It was at a conference I had been involved with since its inception, a gathering of patient advocates and medical professionals. I was old now, moving slowly with a walker, my voice not as strong as it once was. But I stood at that podium and told my story one last time. I talked about the accident, about waking up to betrayal, about the long road of recovery. I talked about building the nonprofit, about the hundreds of patients and families I had worked with over the years. I talked about Marcus, about learning to love and trust again, about the life we had built together. And I talked about what I had learned about resilience and humanity and the capacity to survive even the worst circumstances. I'm not special, I said. I'm not stronger or braver than anyone else who has gone through trauma. I just kept going. I had help, I had resources, I had luck, and I made a choice every day to keep moving forward. That's all resilience is. It's not some heroic quality. It's just the decision to take one more step, even when you don't know where you're going. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes. People were crying, including me. It felt like a fitting end to decades of work, a way to close the chapter on this part of my life. I lived 3 more years after that final speech, quiet years spent in my little house with visits from friends and volunteers from the nonprofit. I read. I gardened when my body allowed it. I wrote letters to people I cared about. I reflected on the strange, difficult, beautiful life I had lived. On what would turn out to be one of my last days, Jennifer came to visit. We sat on my porch, 2 old women watching the world go by, and she asked me the question I had been asked so many times over the years. Do you have any regrets? I thought about it carefully, the way I always did. I regret the pain, I said. Mine and everyone else's. I wish people didn't have to suffer the way they do. But do I regret the path my life took? No. I became who I was supposed to be. It just took a terrible detour to get there. You helped a lot of people, Jennifer said. That has to count for something. It counts for everything, I said. It's the only thing that made the suffering make sense. We sat in comfortable silence, the way old friends can. I thought about the girl I had been, driving home from her mother's house on an ordinary Wednesday evening, completely unaware that her life was about to shatter. I thought about the woman who had woken up in a hospital bed to discover her husband had abandoned her. I thought about the advocate I had become, the organization I had built, the lives I had touched. It had been a hard life, in many ways harder than it should have been. But it had also been a meaningful one. I had taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and transformed it into something that helped others. I had survived betrayal and built new love. I had faced my own limitations and worked within them to create something valuable. In the end, That was enough. It had to be enough. And sitting there on my porch with my oldest friend beside me, watching the sun set on another day, I found that it was,